Watching my son Mark and his wife Sarah exchange a knowing glance across the dining room table was the first crack in the foundation of my world. It wasn't just a glance. It was a silent, smug conversation, a shared secret that excluded me, the woman who had given them everything. They had just finished explaining, for the third time that week, how my large old house was simply too much for me now, especially after my husband's passing. "It's just sitting here, Mom," Mark had said, gesturing expansively with a forkful of my pot roast. All that equity tied up. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below, and if you believe family should protect, not exploit each other. Hit that like button and subscribe for more. They talked about unlocking value, about modernizing, about finding me a lovely, maintenance-free condo. It sounded reasonable on the surface, like concerned children looking out for their elderly mother. But the glance, that calculating flicker in their eyes, planted a seed of unease that would bloom into a bitter realization. My husband, Robert, had died 2 years prior, leaving me comfortable but not wealthy. He left me the house, paid off, and a modest portfolio he'd managed carefully. We had always been generous with the children, helping Mark and Sarah with a down payment on their first home, contributing significantly to Lisa and David's endless string of urgent financial crises, paying for grandchildren's activities. It was what parents did, we believed. We supported our family. That was our life's work. But what she discovered next would force her to choose between family loyalty and self-preservation. I was a woman in her late 60s, navigating widowhood, and the quiet hum of a house that once echoed with more laughter and noise. My life was simple, centered around my garden, my book club, and visits from my 4 grandchildren, whom I adored. Mark and Sarah were my oldest, seemingly the most successful. Lisa was my younger daughter, perpetually struggling financially, often tearfully calling with tales of woe that always seemed to require a check from Mom. Her husband, David, was quiet, agreeable, and frankly, not much help to Lisa or himself. I had always seen my home as my sanctuary and my primary asset, meant to sustain me through retirement and eventually pass down, perhaps funding the grandchildren's education or helping them start their own lives. I trusted my children implicitly. After all, they were my flesh and blood. Who else would look out for me? Mark worked in finance, Sarah in real estate. They spoke my language of assets and investments, but with a veneer of sophistication that made my own understanding feel suddenly inadequate. They began dropping by more often, ostensibly to check on me, but the conversation inevitably steered towards the house, my finances, my future needs. Lisa, meanwhile, doubled down on her own hardship narrative, her calls becoming more frequent, laced with passive-aggressive comments about how lucky others were to have family who truly understood hardship. "Some people just don't know what it's like," she'd sigh dramatically into the phone after I explained I couldn't give her a large sum for another one of David's failed business ventures. I knew she meant me. I started noticing things. Mark asking pointed questions about the exact balance in my investment accounts. Sarah casually leaving real estate brochures for condos that were significantly smaller and further away from my established community. Lisa asking if I had ever considered consolidating my assets to make things simpler for them later. It felt less like concern and more like inventory. One evening, Mark and Sarah were over for dinner. I excused myself to get dessert from the kitchen. Their voices, slightly muffled, carried from the dining room. "She still doesn't get it," I heard Mark say, sounding impatient. Sarah replied, "Just keep pushing the condo angle. Make it sound like it's her idea. The less hassle, the better. We need that equity freed up before." Well, my blood ran cold. Before what? What hassle? What about my needs, my life? It wasn't about my comfort or simplicity. It was about freeing up equity, my equity. My house wasn't my home to them. It was a dormant investment they wanted to liquidate. That night, I couldn't sleep. The trust one had so freely given felt violated. The initial disbelief was immense. No, I told myself. No, They couldn't possibly be planning something like that. It's just good financial advice. They just want me to be secure. I tried to rationalize their words, twisting them into innocent concern. But the cold, hard calculation in Mark's voice, the casual dismissal of me as a person with her own desires, she still doesn't get it, chipped away at my denial. I didn't confront them. I didn't know how. My heart ached with a profound sense of hurt and confusion. Instead, I took a small, quiet step. The next day, while they were at work, I found the house deed and tucked it away in a safety deposit box at the bank, a box I hadn't touched in years. It felt like a childish act, hiding a treasure, but it was the only way I knew, instinctively, to protect it. It was the first tiny barrier I erected against the people I loved most. The pressure didn't let up. It intensified, subtly at first, then more overtly. Mark started calling almost daily, detailing market trends, emphasizing the urgency of selling the house while the market was hot. Sarah sent me listings for bleak, unappealing condos, following up with calls asking my opinion, framing it as exciting future planning. Lisa's calls became less about her own problems and more about my perceived vulnerabilities. "Mom, are you sure you're managing everything okay?" she'd ask, her voice laced with false sweetness. "Mark says the stock market is so complicated right now. It must be a lot for you." She even suggested I give one of them, preferably her, she implied, power of attorney, just to make things easier if I ever felt overwhelmed. They were creating a narrative of my incompetence, softly questioning my ability to handle my own affairs. This was the real escalation. They weren't just after my money. They were trying to undermine my confidence, perhaps even lay the groundwork for something more legally invasive. The unease solidified into cold dread. I wasn't just hurt anymore. I was starting to feel afraid. This realization pushed me from passive worry to active, albeit quiet, defense. I started keeping a journal, not just of my feelings, but of dates, times, specific requests, and veiled threats. Mark's insistence on controlling my investments, Sarah's push for a quick sale, Lisa's questions about power of attorney, it all went into the journal. I started saving their texts and emails, their words a chilling record of their intentions. I made copies of all my financial statements, utility bills, property tax records, anything that proved I was competently managing my life and assets. One afternoon, after Mark had been particularly aggressive on the phone about the wasted potential of my property, I drove to a law office recommended by a trusted friend from my book club, a friend whose husband was a retired judge. I was nervous walking in, feeling foolish for suspecting my own children. But the lawyer, a kind, sharp woman named Ms. Davies, listened patiently as I haltingly explained my concerns, showing her the journal entries and saved messages. She didn't dismiss my fears as paranoia. She asked calm, probing questions, her expression growing serious as I recounted the details. She explained the concept of undue influence, financial elder abuse, and the steps people sometimes take to gain control of an elder's assets, including challenging their competency. She confirmed my worst fears. Their actions fit a pattern she had seen before. She advised me on legal steps to protect myself, updating my will to explicitly state my wishes and name an executor not connected to Mark or Lisa, creating a durable power of attorney designating someone trustworthy, like my friend, she suggested, and potentially putting the house into a trust. We discussed the importance of documentation, the journal, the messages, recorded conversations, if legal in my state and done correctly. This was the turning point. Knowledge was power. I wasn't helpless. I had options. Leaving Ms. Davies' office, I felt a quiet strength I hadn't felt in months. I wasn't just reacting. I was planning. The fear hadn't vanished, but it was now channeled into strategic action. My children's pressure intensified. They sensed my resistance, the subtle shift in my compliance. Mark became impatient, his voice sharper. "Mom, honestly, you're dragging your feet on this. The market isn't going to wait forever. Sarah began hinting that my reluctance was hurting them, preventing their financial progress. Lisa resorted to overt guilt trips. The children really need braces, Mom, and David's business is just. I don't know what we'll do. It would mean so much if you could just help us now instead of waiting for. Later, they weren't even pretending anymore. They wanted my money, and they wanted it immediately. One evening, Mark and Sarah came over unannounced. They sat me down in the living room, their faces set. This was the second mandatory antagonist micro-cameo, and it was chillingly direct. Mom, Mark started, his tone serious, we've been talking. We're really worried about you, Sarah nodded solemnly. With Dad gone, and you getting older. Managing everything is just so much, Mark leaned forward. We think it's best if we take over your finances. Just manage things for you. It would take all the stress off your shoulders. We could set you up with a small allowance. Of course, he said small allowance, as if he were granting me a favor in my own home, with my own money. We've even drafted some papers, Sarah added, pulling a folder from her bag. It was a power of attorney document and a proposal for a conservatorship. They wanted me to sign over control, potentially my autonomy, without even discussing it properly first. My hands trembled, but not from fear. From cold, controlled rage. I looked at the documents, then at their expectant faces. They looked like vultures, waiting to pick the bones clean. No, I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. I will not be doing that. Their faces fell, replaced by disbelief, then anger. Mom, this isn't a game, Mark exclaimed, his voice rising. We're trying to help you. Help yourselves, you mean? I replied, the words surprising even myself with their firmness. Sarah's eyes narrowed. Fine. If you want to be difficult, Mom. Don't say we didn't try to do this the easy way. Mark stood up. You're being irrational. We'll pursue other options. They left abruptly, leaving the ominous folder on the coffee table. The threat was clear. If I didn't comply, they would try to force it legally, perhaps by claiming I was no longer competent. That night, I didn't just feel resolved, I felt an unshakable determination. They had shown their hand. They were not concerned children, they were predators. And I would not become their prey. I had already started implementing Ms. Davies' advice. I had met with her again, signed a new will naming my friend as executor, and completed the paperwork for a durable power of attorney for healthcare, also naming my friend. We had discussed setting up a trust for the house, but decided to wait. Moving too quickly might tip them off. I also took a bolder step. I quietly moved a significant portion of my savings and investments into new accounts at a different bank, accounts the children didn't know about, changing my direct deposit for my pension. I left enough in the old accounts to appear normal for a while, but the bulk of my liquid assets were now secure. I also installed a discrete security camera system, recommended by Ms. Davies, focused on the entry points of the house. I started recording their visits and calls, ensuring it was legal by having one-party consent in my state and informing certain people, like my friend and lawyer, I was doing so for my protection. I told Lisa I was cutting back expenses and couldn't help her financially for the foreseeable future, citing my own need to be cautious. Her reaction was a torrent of angry tears and accusations of being uncaring. It hurt, but I held firm. The financial taps were closing, and they were feeling it. The smoking gun arrived unexpectedly, tucked away in the folder Mark and Sarah had left behind. It wasn't the power of attorney papers, which were standard boilerplate. It was a printed email chain, seemingly forgotten or overlooked, tucked inside a side pocket of the folder. It was between Mark and Sarah, dated several months prior. The subject line read, House plan. The body of the emails discussed timelines for getting me into a condo, projected profits from selling my house after minimal renovations, and detailed calculations of how long they would need to manage my money to recoup their investment, meaning the time and effort they were putting into the scheme. The most damning part was an email from Sarah to Mark, clearly outlining a strategy to encourage Mom's friends to report concerns about her memory or judgment, to build a case for challenging my competency, mentioning specific friends they thought might be easily manipulated. It wasn't just financial manipulation, it was a malicious plan to undermine my social support and potentially strip me of my legal rights. My hands shook as I read, but this time, it wasn't fear or rage. It was a cold, clear certainty. I had everything I needed. Ms. Davies was quiet as she reviewed the email chain. This, she said, tapping a finger on the printout, is compelling evidence of intent to defraud and undue influence. This changes things significantly. The conservatorship documents they had drafted were standard, but this email provided the context, their true motive. It was the legal weapon I needed. With this evidence, Ms. Davies advised a different approach. Instead of waiting for them to make their move, we would make ours. We decided to file a civil suit detailing their scheme, seeking damages and, more importantly, a restraining order preventing them from contacting me or interfering with my finances or property. We also decided to file a police report detailing the potential elder abuse and fraud based on the emails and my documentation. My counter-strategy was simple: exposure and legal shutdown. I would hit them where it hurt the most, their wallets and their reputations. They wouldn't see it coming. They were so focused on their own plotting, they hadn't noticed the careful, quiet walls I had been building around myself. Their overconfidence was their undoing. Mark and Sarah were busy selling their narrative to anyone who would listen. Distant relatives, my former neighbors, even some of my more casual acquaintances, painting a picture of a frail, confused old woman who needed her capable children to step in before she squandered her assets or fell victim to scams. They were so convinced of their cleverness, they didn't notice the registered letters, the official-looking envelopes arriving at their doors. The legal documents were served on a Tuesday morning. A civil complaint detailing Mark and Sarah's scheme, citing the email evidence and my documentation, coupled with a temporary restraining order. Simultaneously, a police detective contacted them regarding the elder abuse report. For Lisa and David, there was a separate legal letter from Ms. Davies formally stating I would no longer be providing them financial assistance and demanding they cease all communication regarding my finances, referencing documented instances of their inappropriate demands. The shock and panic were immediate and palpable, even from a distance. My phone, which had been relatively quiet since I started limiting communication, exploded. Missed calls piled up, 40, 50 more. Voicemails were left, starting with anger, quickly dissolving into tearful pleas, then escalating into frantic, desperate threats. "Mom, what is this?" Mark screamed into one message. "Are you insane? You're ruining us." Sarah left messages alternating between feigned hurt, "How could you do this to your own family?" and barely contained rage, "We were trying to help. You'll regret this." Lisa's messages were pure hysteria, wailing about how I was abandoning them, how I didn't love my grandchildren, how I was a cruel, selfish woman. David even left a stilted, awkward message, clearly prompted by Lisa, asking me to reconsider. I didn't answer a single call. I didn't respond to a single text. I followed Ms. Davies' strict instructions: zero contact. All communication was now handled by her office. She informed me that Mark and Sarah were scrambling, their lawyer clearly shocked by the email evidence. The temporary restraining order meant they couldn't come near me or my property, and they couldn't access or attempt to access any of my accounts. The truth, backed by irrefutable legal documentation, began to spread quietly through the family and the community they had tried to manipulate. Those they had tried to turn against me saw the evidence and recoiled. The narrative they had so carefully constructed crumbled instantly. Their final, desperate tactics were futile. They tried showing up at my friend's house, who calmly called the police. They tried contacting distant relatives to pressure me, who, armed with information from my lawyer, largely ignored them. They sent more frantic, increasingly unhinged messages, alternating between apologies and threats. I remained calm, detached. I had played the long game, gathered my evidence, built my legal fortress. Now, I simply had to wait for the legal process to unfold. They were in freefall, and I was standing on solid ground. In the immediate aftermath, the house felt incredibly quiet. The phone was silent now, the barrage of calls having ceased as they realized I would not break. The silence was not lonely, it was peaceful. Ms. Davies confirmed the court had made the restraining order permanent and had issued financial injunctions protecting my assets. Mark and Sarah faced legal repercussions for their actions, including potential civil penalties and the cloud of the police report. Lisa and David received no further funds from me, and the expectation of future inheritance was gone. My new boundaries were simple and firm: no contact. My life was now my own again, not a resource to be managed or exploited. I spent my days in my garden, reading, seeing the few friends who had stood by me, and enjoying the quiet security of my protected home. There was no grand reconciliation, no tearful apologies that healed all wounds. The betrayal had cut too deep for that. My relationship with my children, as I had known it, was over. But in its place grew something stronger: my own self-respect and a quiet, unshakable peace. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed this story, give this video a like if you haven't already, and subscribe for more stories about standing up for yourself.